Okay, hello. This is a continuation of my summary on how the United States is starting a new Cold War with Russia. We've been focusing on the Industrial Revolution and how that made warfare super profitable. Okay, to understand the Industrial Revolution, we're examining it in 8 stages. The first stage was machine manufacture of textiles. That kicked off the whole Industrial Revolution. And then next was use of machines in agriculture about the 1830s. Following this was the use of machines in printing, which led to the penny press and really boosted the potential for propaganda. First used in pumping up patriotism, and again about 1830s that occurred. And then we studied the third stage, which is the impact of steam engines. Had a huge impact upon not just the Industrial Revolution, but economics and warfare. And then today we're going to focus on the fourth stage, which is machine manufacture of weapons and munitions. And the purpose was for something called interchangeability, a big fancy term for uniformity in weapons and parts and ammunition. All right. Now, early pioneers that pushed this idea of interchangeability were Andre Blanc. He was a French guy, and in the United States, Eli Whitney was tasked to push this. Right. As far as I read, he didn't really contribute much. I think they probably they selected him because of his fame in the cotton gin and the huge impact upon economics the cotton gin had. But this resulted in the American system of manufacturing, which was machine mass production of arms, and it was perfected between 1820 roughly and 1850. All right. So it resulted in a great increase in production volume of weapons. So that resulted in a great increase in profits from arms production, which made the military industrial complex possible. It didn't manifest until World War One, right? But the groundwork, the foundation was laid here. So I say the American system of mass production by machines had no impact on the Crimean War. Crimean War was 1853 to 56, right, when it was perfected. But this was an American development, not a European. This is a European war here. Great Britain, France, Russia, right? And Turkey was involved. All right. However, it did have a great effect upon the U.S. Civil War, 1861 to 65, right? And the effect was a massive increase in firepower, and also on the side that's related to steam engines here and railroads. Railroads had a huge impact upon the emergence for the first time of modern mobile warfare, maneuver warfare, limited by trains and train tracks, right? But modern logistics of war too. Uh, all right, there was no military-industrial complex yet, but at the time of the Civil War, there were plenty of war profiteers. Right, these are scumbags that cheated the government, produced shoddy products for soldiers, causing the soldiers to suffer, right, to make a profit. Same type of people, same character that would be in the military industrial complex. They don't care how people suffer, right? They just care about their own profits. Uh, the economic impact was not in the military industrial complex of the Civil War. The key economic impact of the Civil War was clearing the way for Western expansion under the Republican model, which we will study in the next lesson down here. Now, Western expansion became the economic engine, just like European colonial expansion was the engine, but it resulted in a great increase in Indian wars. I mean, as we expand Western expansion, as that accelerates, you got to clear out the Indians at a higher rate. So that required more wars. Now, a key significance of the American system was development eventually of the assembly line, right? So this machine mass production method eventually led to the development of assembly line production, first used in Singer sewing machines, and then Ransom Olds used it to manufacture cars, and then Henry Ford followed after these guys. So Henry Ford is usually credited with the assembly line, all right, but it actually was applied before him. All right, so let's go into greater detail. All right, first thing I want to do is show you some early underpinnings of the military-industrial complex, some historical roots. However, the military-industrial complex would not manifest until World War I. Right, the first thing was the rise of national militaries, occurring first in France under Louis XIV's government, led by Colbert. He was their main minister. And here's a quote from Colbert and Palmer, excellent book on Western history. Quote, the growth of the army and the fact that under Louis XIV, the government clothed and equipped the soldiers and hence placed unprecedentedly large orders for uniforms, overcoats, weapons, and ammunition, greatly stimulated the employment of weavers, tailors, and gunsmiths, and the advanced the commercial capitalism by which such labor were organized. In general, trade and manufacture developed in France under more direct government guidance than in England. So this is the underpinnings of an economy driven by war production. Okay, so that's leading to the military-industrial complex. All right, and this was further shown in Prussia. So again, the same book, page 222, quote, the government, Prussian government, as in France under Colbert, initiated and helped to finance various industries, but the importance of such government participation was greater than in France because the amount of privately owned capital available for investment was incomparably less. Military needs, more than elsewhere, dominated the market for goods because civilian demand in so poor a country was relatively low, so that the army, in its requirement for food, uniforms, and weapons, was a strong force in shaping the economic growth of the country. So again, the military and military industry being a substantial sector of the economy, a pillar of the economy, right? And that would be seen in, for example, the military-industrial complex in the United States in the 20th century, World War I, World War II, so forth, right? The Cold War. All right, so places where the American system of machine mass production developed. And it was in armories, first in weapons. All right. One army was Springfield, Massachusetts Armory, and another was Harper's Ferry, West Virginia Armory. Right. So the state of Massachusetts is kind of a flat, long state. It's somewhere in the western southern part of Massachusetts. There's Boston. Right. Here is the Armory factory, and Harper's Ferry is in West Virginia, very close to Washington, D.C. There's Washington, D.C. There's Baltimore. All right. West Virginia kind of wraps like this, kind of comes up at an angle here. And this is like the northeast corner of West Virginia. Okay. All right. So historically, that's where it developed. Now, we mentioned the Crimean War and its effect. We said the Crimean War came too early to be involved in the American system of machine mass production of weapons. All right, the Europeans were slower to adopt this system. However, the Crimean War was a boon. Its economic impact was felt by the United States. It was a boon for the U.S. economy and a stimulus for Western expansion, especially in agriculture exports for war, which helped drive Western expansion and railroad development. For example, there was a big increase in agricultural sales to Great Britain and France when all these young men left their farms and went off to war, right? So their loss of agriculture production in those countries was made up for by imports from the United States. So this was a great boon for U.S. Agricultural export, and that drove railroad development. All right. World War One. It also proved the profitability of war. Now, World War One and World War Two would prove to be even much more profitable. So the Crimean War greatly increased demand for agricultural products out of the United States, and that enticed speculative overinvestment in land and railroads. For example, a key speculator was the Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company. Now, the end of the Crimean War killed demand. War ended, all these soldiers returned back to their farms, right? They didn't have to buy U.S. ag, so it killed U.S. demand for U.S. ag. There was market oversaturation, railroads failed, banks failed, farms failed. All right, as banks failed, capital dried up, and the economy tanked. Without capital to run businesses, businesses failed across the board. So the end of the Crimean War set. The end of the Crimean War set the principal, or was the principal cause of the Depression of 1857-59. And the Crimean War set the pattern of the later 19th century business cycles. Boom time followed by speculative overinvestment, oversaturated, overinvested market, right? And that causing failure as prices plummeted, and that farms failed, railroads failed because they had no freight to carry. And as railroads failed, banks that were overly invested in railroads failed, right? Resulted in depressions. So this is the pattern, and you can see it clearly in railroad construction. So this is a graph of the amount of railroad construction nationally, each year by year. And this shows depressions, depression there, depression there, depression there, depression there. Okay, so Crimean War was 1853 to 1856. All right, you see a big spike in speculative overinvestment here. All right, war ends. There's a plummet in demand. All right, all that overinvested land, overdeveloped railroads, they fail. All right, as they fail, that causes banks to fail who invested in all this, and capital dries up, and you got a depression. Lasts from 57 to 59. Okay. Then this is the Civil War era. There's not much railroad construction because all those men are off fighting wars. All right. But at the end of the Civil War, Western expansion was unleashed, and there's a major rise in railroad construction as you're expanding into into Western territory, right? And then it drops off. When you have a drop off in railroad expansion, right? Railroads are failing. You have overinvestment. Railroads are failing. Banks are failing. Capital's drying up, and then you get a depression. So you have the depression of 1873 to 1879, a pretty significant depression. And this was primarily caused by, almost exclusively caused by, the failure of Jay Gould's Northern Pacific Railroad, which caused the failure of his bank. And he was leveraged out to all sorts of investors and all sorts of other banks, causing them to go bankrupt. And it took down banks like a chain of dominoes. And that took down our economy. And the key thing that set off this failure was by 1873, Jay Gould's Northern Pacific Railroad had reached Bismarck, North Dakota, which is right on the border of Indian Territory. Right? So he couldn't reasonably, expand his railroad into Indian Territory without the U.S. government going to war with the Sioux and clearing them out. All right. So he could get investors. Investors saw this. He couldn't get investors. Without investors, his railroad failed, right? And his bank failed. And then his bank took down all sorts of other banks and took down the whole damn economy. Now, a similar thing happened after this depression. What pulled the U.S. out of the depression was Western expansion, big Western expansion boom, big railroad expansion. Again, over speculation in land and railroads, over investment, all right, and that causing a crash, right? When demand falls a little bit, all these investments fail. When they fail, it takes down banks. All right. When banks fail, it takes down the economy. Right. Same thing happens. Over speculation in Western expansion driven depression right here. Railroad takes it down. And then you have a fast recovery that pulls us out. Western expansion pulls us out of the depression. Right. But then it peaks here. All right. And you see railroad construction falling off. And you got the depression of 1893. Now, there's other factors involved in this depression, and I know if I say that the sole cause was the failure of Western expansion, saturation of Western expansion, people are going to go crazy and attack, all right? But it was a key cause, as we'll see, the main cause, and I will give you a far greater, more in-depth analysis of all the factors that led to the Great Depression of 1893 to 98, right? All these other factors, financial panic, right? The Barings Brothers bank failure, and so forth. European financial crisis, right? Gold standard and tight money, shortage of capital, that causing deflationary pressure, right? I'll try to explain all this. Oh, Sherman Act, right, which created silver currency in the U.S., right, and how that had an effect upon Gresham's law, right? I'll explain all this later. All right. So the end of the Crimean War resulted in the Depression of 1857-59, showing you the importance of war upon economics, right? And the Crimean War set the pattern of the latter 19th century business cycles. Boom time, over speculation, over investment, oversaturated markets, railroads then tank, taking down banks, right? Drying up capital, resulting in other businesses failing, and you have a depression, right? Now, as an aside, a lesser effect of the Crimean War was the need for more powerful cannons, and that drove the development of steel production, right? Which resulted in the invention of the Bessemer process of steel production, and it was the first mass production of steel. Steel would have the only significant impact of the fifth stage of the Industrial Revolution. All the other things involved in the fifth stage, like telegraph, telephone, oil, internal combustion engine, the chemical industry, right? All those things were developed in the 19th century, but would not become significant markets until the 20th century, often well into the 20th century. All right. So really, steel was the main player of the fifth stage of the Industrial Revolution, and even then, its impact was almost exclusively in railroad construction. In the 19th century, 95% of all steel produced went into railroads. All right. So that was a big player, railroads and Western expansion, as far as industry was involved. All right. Now, I show you in this diagram that the real impact of the Civil War was the unleashing of Western expansion economics, right? In 1861, at the start of the Civil War, less than half of the USA was settled, which means cleared of Indians, getting the Indians kicked out or put on the reservations. Within only 29 years, the remainder of the nation would be subjugated, right? So really, in 1861, only this section here you could say was settled, cleared of Indians, made available for use by white men, right? Minnesota was not included. The Sioux were dominant in Minnesota at this time, right? Iowa was cleared, Missouri cleared, Arkansas down here, Louisiana, pretty much cleared of Indians. So this portion here, now that's less than half of the USA, maybe about 40%, right? It's closer to 1/3 than it is to half, I'd say. So what that means is, from the time Englishmen settled at Jamestown in Virginia, right, to the Civil War, less than half the country was settled, and that took 258 years. Then, in the next 29 years, all right, the rest of the country was settled. So it took less than 1/10 of the time to settle the rest of the country. It took 258 years here, right? 29 years here, and that was the key thing that made that possible was the Civil War. So the key effect economically on our country, right, was not the freeing of the slaves. It was the opening up of Western expansion, the unleashing of Western expansion, and that was made possible by the U.S. Civil War through legislation for Western expansion, which had been bottled up and blocked by the South when the South was involved. As soon as the South seceded from the Union, all right, the Congress, the House and Senate was controlled by the North, and the border states, which were slave states that remained in the Union: Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware. All right, so that was totally controlled by the North. And now, did they rush to free the slaves? Did they pass legislation to free the slaves? Did they pass an amendment? No. They passed an amendment to guarantee slavery forever for the South to avoid a war. All right. But what they did was, once the war started, they passed all their legislation for Western expansion. The Morrill Tariff, all right? The Homestead Act, free land in the West, all right? The Morrill Act for land-grant colleges to teach the science of agriculture, animal husbandry, of railroad construction, of mining, of bridge construction, all the things you need to teach your people for Western expansion. They passed the Pacific Railroad Act, financing of railroads, transcontinental railroads to the Pacific, right? They passed national currency, the greenback. They passed national bank. All of these were a unified system for Western expansion. So that made Western expansion economically possible, the financing and laws for it, right? So that resulted in a big boom, and that drove the U.S. economy in the latter part of the 19th century. With these cycles, boom and bust, right? The key pillar was Western expansion economics, right? It was a combination of industrial growth supported by expansion and development of resources to get the raw materials to feed your industries, right? Plus, it created markets for the outlet of manufactured goods. Now, that was the same economic engine that drove European nations, except they did industrial growth with colonial expansion in foreign territory. We did it within our own boundaries Of course, it was Indian territory, so we had to kill off the Indians, right? That's why there was a big acceleration in Indian wars. And this shows it on this map. This is that Indian battles. It's only a sample of battles. There are far more battles, but a sample of the key battles during 1860 to 1890. 1890 being the last main battle. That was Wounded Knee right there. 1890 kind of marked the end of the settlement of the. Once you got the last key battle here, you could say that the West was pretty much settled by the U.S. White man's control of the West, right? You see Minnesota, like I said, key battles, Sioux Wars, 1862. These battles, right? They're cleared out during the Civil War, but then they moved on into the Dakotas and into Wyoming, right? That's where Little Bighorn was, right? They had to be further cleared out, especially to get that Northern Pacific Railroad going across. Northern Pacific left from Duluth here, went across, went through Bismarck, North Dakota, right about there somewhere, North Dakota, right, and went across here, went across Wyoming, wrapped around here, and went across to Puget Sound, right? Okay, but that opened all this territory for development. Great agricultural land up here. This western Idaho, eastern. Plus, there's gold out here. There's gold out here. There's gold in the Black Hills too. Okay. All right. So the last thing I'll show you is a very simplified version of what I'll teach down here. I'm going to teach a more detailed analysis of Western expansion economics here. But this is very simple. It shows Western expansion economics that drove the Gilded Age, the greatest rate of U.S. economic growth. All right. So it shows, I say here, key concepts. Money must be recycled. All right. The cyclical flow of money and goods drives the economy. In fact, if you increase the velocity of money cycling, that grows the economy. And in fact, GDP is measured in the equation, the overall money supply times the velocity of money. It's not just how much money there is, it's how fast that money is cycled. So as you cycle it faster, that causes economic growth. Now, in Western expansion economics, right, you're expanding west, developing the land. You can only develop the land if you can build railroads to get goods to market. All right? And you couldn't build railroads unless you have land developed to carry freight. All right? So they went hand in hand. So as you're moving out west, you're developing the land, you're producing resources from that land. Those raw material resources are going back to the east to be used by industries. All right? Now, in payment for those raw materials, money goes back this way. That allows for economic growth in the western region, development of towns and so forth. But to do so, you got to purchase manufactured goods. So money's going back this way to purchase manufactured goods, whatever is needed, building materials, tools, firearms, all right? Whiskey, whatever, manufactured food products and so forth, coming back this way, right? Money's going back this way. So you see the cyclical flow of money and materials. Raw materials going this way, manufactured goods going this way. This supporting the industries over here in both raw materials and purchase of manufactured goods, right? And this was the simple economic engine that drove the U.S. economy. Now, I'll teach you a much more detailed explanation of Western expansion, economics, and legislation that allowed it in this diagram. But that's the next lesson. So here's the final review. Stage 4 of the Industrial Revolution was machine manufacture of weapons and munitions. It was driven by the need for interchangeability of weapons and munitions, which is uniformity of weapons parts and ammunition, right? So let's say you break a part of your musket or rifle. Well, you don't have to replace it with a whole new rifle. You just replace the part because it's all interchangeable. And ammunition can be used by any rifle because it's all same caliber, same gauge, whatever. All right. Now, this resulted in what's called the American system of mass production. That eventually led to the assembly line production by the late 19th century. First used by Singer sewing machine, then by Ransom Olds automobiles. Oldsmobiles. Um, the American system came too late to be applied to the Crimean War. However, the Crimean War shed a spotlight on the economic stimulus of war and on economic expansion business cycles that would be repeated in the latter part of the 19th century. Over and over, same cycle. Now, machine mass production of weapons did have an impact upon the Civil War, especially increasing firepower. However, the greatest effect of the Civil War was the unleashing of Western expansion economics, which will be examined in detail in the next lesson. A key takeaway, though, is uh, uh, machine mass production. The four stages of the Industrial Revolution had a big impact upon the economic benefit of war, setting the foundation for the military-industrial complex. All right.